Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Glasgow for Europe's live stream. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome Dominic Grieve, who's making a second appearance with us. I also want to introduce Paul Miller, who's making sure all the tech works out for us, and Jenny Breslin, who will pick up any questions that come in through social media. So if you have any, you can paste them on Facebook or Twitter, and we'll try and get round to them during the chat. I'm sure everybody knows Dominic Grieve, so I'm not going to do a lengthy introduction. But just to mention particular relevance tonight, I think, is that you were chair of the commission that produced the governance report on ethics and some changes proposed to probity in public life, and you're also vice president of the European movement. And those two things, I think, neatly link together the themes that we've got for tonight's discussion, namely Europe, ethics, and standards in public life. So, anyway, you're very welcome, Dominic, and thank you very much for joining us. Maybe just to start off by finishing something off, which is you last joined us on the live stream in October 2020, and at that point the Russia report was quite a hot topic. It had been published, I think, in July, and was still quite a live issue. And I suppose the first question is, whatever happened to it, what became of it, what tangible outcomes emerged from it, or was it successfully buried, and will we hear something more of it?
To an extent, it's been buried. The government did respond. It did actually publish its response at the same time as it came out, because it had 6 months. And broadly speaking, the interesting thing was it accepted most of what was in it, namely that Russia was a threat, that it said it was doing all things necessary and adequate to counter the Russian threat. And on threats to our democracy, if you remember, it had already admitted that there was clear evidence of Russian attempts to influence the 2019 election, which was the first time UK government had admitted that there was evidence of bots and other things being generated by the Russians, which were designed to influence voters. But interestingly, nobody has asked in this election whether there is also evidence of this happening on the internet or not. And I think it would be quite an interesting question to ask. And the government's got no reason not to respond to it, and could indeed do so while the election's taking place. Of course, when you do get interference by bots and other things, you can't tell what effect it's having on people. You can just tell that, in fact, it's happening. But the subject hasn't gone away. There is, I think, a much greater awareness that Russia is a predatory nation and is interfering at multiple levels wherever it can. And I think its evidence of trying to influence politics in Europe more generally is absolutely clear. And of course, there's now the edge to it that this is not just about Russia's long-term standing, it's also about the war in the Ukraine. But on that, in fairness, I don't have any reason to think the UK government is acting in a pusillanimous or improper fashion on the Ukraine. There are real anxieties about what's happening in countries like Germany and to a lesser extent France, as to the attitude of future governments towards resisting Russia or trying to push the Ukrainians into effectively a surrender. And that remains very unclear. And of course, the biggest anxiety of the lot, will there be a Donald Trump presidency, and will he simply pull the rug on supporting the Ukrainians completely, which would be, I think, for Europe, a seismic and incredibly dangerous moment. But just hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Jenny, did you have something from a question from social media?
Yeah, so there's a question coming from Jenny in Glasgow, and she's asking, what exactly does Russia gain from close political ties with UK politicians?
Well, it believes, I think, it gets influence. Whether it does or not is, I think, another matter. But there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Russia sees its expatriate community, if it has leverage over them, as agents of influence in the country in which they are. And a large number of them have been in Britain. This is why the issue about oligarchs was relevant in our report. And oligarchs support political parties, they network within the social milieu in which they happen to be. And I think, and if they still have ties to Russia, worth bearing in mind that some of them have come to the UK essentially to escape Putin and have given up all economic ties to Russia. But in the majority of cases, they still have ties to Russia. And the evidence is overwhelming that therefore they will be required by Putin to do things for him. It's a mafia state. He tolerates, in some cases, very high levels of unlawful behavior and illegality, as long as he thinks it's in his interests. And if you then decide to ignore him, then the risks are that you either end up in a Siberian gulag, as has happened to some of his opponents, or indeed you end up dead at the bottom of a balcony, below a balcony. So it's a very real issue. And this was why we highlighted that it was naive within the United Kingdom to think that they were not being used, some of them, as agents of influence. Now, that said, you can make the argument that, I think it was Mr. Johnson's argument, that he might be friendly with Mr. Lebedev, Lord Lebedev as he now is, but it didn't have any impact on his willingness to resist Russia over the Ukraine. And I accept that that's the case. But on the other hand, you also have to ask the question whether cozying up to people who continue to have, or continued, because I do think things have changed very markedly now, but cozying up to people who continued to have very close relations to the Russian regime, to what extent that sends out a false message that the United Kingdom is not very bothered about what Putin does. And as we should be aware, Putin clearly gambled in 2022 that there would be very little Western resistance to his destroying the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, he got it wrong. But those are sorts of miscalculations, which on the whole, I think you need to avoid in international relations. Yep. And you can argue that in 2014, we didn't do anything like sufficient to resist what after the Russian annexation of the Crimea.
Yeah. Okay, well, just moving the conversation on. One of the things that you've been involved in recently is the governance project, and today we've seen a joint statement by the commission that you chaired, and along with the Institute for Government and the Constitution unit, emphasising, I think, about seven recommendations, for reforms to the way that government and Parliament works. I wonder if you could maybe just give us a bit of background to the project, or to your project, say, and why it was done, who backed it, who funded it, what was the motivation for it?
It has a strange background in a way. I was approached about just over a year ago by a group of semi-retired London solicitors in London big law firms, who were absolutely appalled by what they saw as governance standards in the UK government, because I think most of them have made their careers in later life advising on corporate governance, which has been very much beefed up in recent years about what's acceptable, conflicts of interest, declarations of interest, standards of behavior. And they were comparing that with what was going on within government, and they thought there was a really serious problem. And they approached me and they said, would I consider chairing a commission? And if we could set one up, drawing people not just from cross-party, but within UK governance, retired civil servants, possibly judges, people who might be able to help. And my first reaction was to say no. And my reason for that was because I've seen too many of these endeavours which end up with nothing happening. So you produce a wonderful report and it scores 0.1 on the Richter scale of media interest, and then it gathers dust on a shelf. But back in the autumn, so this was over a year ago, so it's 18 months ago they approached me. It was the end of 2022. And in mid-2023, they came back to it. I was also very busy at that time. And they said, look, we actually think that the Labour Party is seriously interested in this. So I made some inquiries, and because I do have links on a cross-party basis, many of which, of course, the result of Brexit, I ascertained to my satisfaction that I thought there really was interest in our doing this. I ended up saying, please don't soft soap me. If you don't want this, I've got other things to do. So we then set up the commission. So there was myself, there was Dame Margaret Hodge, who's of course a Labour MP, just now retiring, Professor David Howarth, who was MP for Cambridge for the Liberal Democrats and is a professor of law, mainly constitutional law, Sir Jonathan Jones, who was the Treasury Solicitor, so the sort of senior civil servant, lawyer civil servant in government, Helen McNamara, who obviously features in Partygate, but was the propriety and ethics civil servant in government, Professor Anand Menon, Lord Newburger of Abbotsbury, who was the president of the Supreme Court, and Baroness Usha Prasha, who is actually at the moment the first commissioner of the civil service commissioner. And we then met intensely in the autumn of last year, thinking about what were the things that we thought were easily done to improve standards of governance, and actually then to provide public reassurance, because we know from Sir John Curtis's surveys up here with you in Glasgow that public trust in politics and politicians is probably at an all-time low. And we were also very conscious that other people have been taking an interest in this, so it wasn't unique to us. Work has been done by the Institute for Government, work has been done by the University College London Constitution Unit, and indeed by other academics. So we freely looked at that work, but in a sense, it was what we thought might make the best difference. And so we ended up coming up with a package of recommendations. They centre firstly around the ministerial standards and the ministerial code. The ministerial code's a funny document. It's split in two. Parts of it is how you run ministers operate, but parts of it about ethics and what is expected ethically of ministers and their standards of behaviour. It's entirely prepared by the Prime Minister. And although the Prime Minister does have an ethics advisor, Sir Laurie Magnus, who's currently doing it, and of course the previous one resigned under Boris Johnson because he was ignored. But the truth is, the ethics advisor is the Prime Minister's appointee to be dismissed at will or ignored at will, and he can only investigate something that the Prime Minister asks the ethics advisor to investigate. So first recommendation, put this on a statutory footing and give the ethics advisor the power to initiate investigations themselves on ministers' behaviour, and to make sure that the ministerial code issued by the Prime Minister, and still the Prime Minister's responsibility, is being followed and observed. And then linked to that, dealing with conflicts of interest, which sometimes, in fairness, I think ministers are rather hung up to dry on this, because there are complex rules on conflicts of interest. Sometimes they get criticised when in fact they've complied completely with what's required of them. So an opportunity to increase transparency and increase effectiveness. Still leave Parliament separate, because Parliament has to self-regulate in order to respect our constitution. But the two could work very closely together, and we recommended that the backroom operation should in fact be consolidated. So you would have a single office probably dealing with MPs' declarations of interest and ministers' declaration of interest and House of Lords' declarations of interest, even if there were separate commissioners. So that's the first, I think actually the most easy thing to do. It could be announced by an incoming Prime Minister. Keir Starmer wanted to do it. He could come along and stand at the dispatch box on day one of a Labour government and say he's doing it. And if you followed that up with primary legislation, then it would be much harder to undo later. Linked to that, Changes to the House of Lords Appointments Commission. I realise lots of people want reform of the House of Lords, totally legitimate topic, but we weren't going to get dragged there. What we were absolutely going to focus on is, can you improve the current system? Well, you can. And the obvious way of doing it is by saying that nobody can be appointed to the House of Lords unless they have been vetted by the House of Lords Appointments Commission and approved. And we know that Boris Johnson appointed people to the House of Lords who had been rejected by the Commission. Mm-hmm. So we would make that impossible, and you'd need a statute to do it. Although, again, the Prime Minister could say at the outset that he would respect it, the decision. And then the other thing is that anybody appointed to the Lords, there should be a statement explaining why they've been appointed and why they're thought to be suitable. Going to the Lords shouldn't really, well, it is an honour in one sense, but it is not an honour as a reward. It should be, it's a working job. If you're going to do it properly, and about 300 of the 800 peers do it very well indeed, there should be a good reason why you're put there. You've got experience, you've got something to offer, and you're willing to put in the work. And we think that that would also be a powerful deterrent on putting somebody in simply as a piece of cronyism. We also think the honours system needs to be reformed. No objection to the honours system as it mainly operates, but prime ministerial honours list, that is the ability of the Prime Minister to nominate anybody he likes for honours, overriding the honours committee system, should be given up. That means no dissolution honours, no resignation honours when a Prime Minister goes. If he thinks somebody should be rewarded for their service at number 10 Downing Street, he puts in a bid to the honours committee and says, I think this or that civil servant or SPAD or individual merits recognition for their public service, and doubtless in most cases they may well get it, but no longer the case that the Prime Minister can dole out knighthoods to ministers when he sacks them. If he thinks that they're worthy of the knighthood, he can put in the application to the Honours Committee, which actually works quite well. Then we also recommended changes to the relationship between the government and the House of Commons. That's much more controversial. But the blunt truth is that the Commons is prevented from doing a proper scrutiny job by the rules that surround its operation. And it has less power in this respect than I think any other comparable parliament in a Western democracy. Doesn't control its own business. It has very limited powers on statutory instruments, and we've made a whole series of recommendations as to how that might be improved. We've also made recommendations on the civil service and its relations with ministers, the appointments of special advisors, and the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission ought to be the independent arbiter of elections and referendums. It's had its wings clipped by the current government quite disgracefully. It ought to be capable of initiating investigations and recommending and bringing prosecutions for people who breach electoral rules and also rules on donations to political parties. Sorry, that's a very potted and rapid explanation of what we're about. But it does seem to have struck a chord. We published in February, and because the IFG and University College London have done similar things, we then decided to team up and invite retired civil servants, judges, and others to sign up to a letter to the Times, which came out this morning. Is accompanied by a document which some touches on one or two things we didn't deal with, like lobbying, for example. But I'm completely in agreement with it, so we signed up to it without difficulty.
Yep.
All I can say is I hope that people will look at it. We sent it cross-party basis. We sent advanced copies to the leaders of the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives, and Labour. They all had it beforehand. We said, this is not aimed at anybody. Please adopt it. I have to say to you, we had some very positive response from the Liberal Democrats, a very positive response to parts of it from Labour, not all of it, although they are considering all of it. I have to say I've had zero response, I regret to say, from my former colleagues from the Prime Minister's office, although in fairness, there are some Conservative former colleagues who are very interested and supportive of what we did.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, the manifestos are quite uneven in the extent to which they.
The Conservatives have got nothing in it.
There's nothing at all. Yeah,
absolutely nothing. Labour's got the suggestion of an overarching ethics advisor, which is the first step in the right direction. But I would like them to go much further than that. And the Liberal Democrats have actually got quite a lot of detailed stuff
Yeah.
in the manifesto about significant constitutional reform as well.
Yep.
But one has to recognise reality, which is I don't think we're going to get a Liberal Democrat government. So really, it's the two main political parties are key targets for this.
Okay. And I mean, just going back to the substance of the report. I mean, there are some of the things that have been most damaging, I think, to public trust that aren't covered by it. I mean, I think thinking particularly of procurement during COVID and the use of WhatsApp messages as a kind of not so much the use of WhatsApp messages, but the failure to retain records of those exchanges and decisions. So were those things that were sort of like, were those not sufficiently low-hanging fruit to include?
No, I think they would be. I mean, on WhatsApp messages, I mean, the point is it is already within the ministerial code, or if it isn't, it should be, but I actually think it is, that ministerial communications need to be done officially and minuted. When I was Attorney General, if you were going to send a message to another minister, it had to be done formally. You did not you might text them for other reasons, but you did not text them. And famously, during COVID, it was Ben Wallace, as Defence Secretary, who refused to participate in a WhatsApp group, saying this is not the way we should be talking to each other. And the ministerial, it is not in the Prime Minister's interest to have such a system. And actually, it should be in the ministerial code that there are official means of communication, just as is in the ministerial code that in the event of legal disagreements between departments, it has to be referred to the Attorney General. So I think that is covered. And it would be a breach of the code if somebody was conducting what I call behind the scenes official government business. And we had this during Brexit, because if you remember, I sought to get hold of the SPAD's WhatsApp and also Telegram and other communications over the prorogation of Parliament, when it was obvious that they had conspired to do this at a time when Mr. Johnson was saying he wasn't going to do it. It had all been done by unofficial channels. On procurement, I mean, that is ultimately a matter for, there are procurement rules. And they do exist. Now, what happened with COVID is that the procurement rules were abandoned. Now, in a sense, you can't prevent that, because, I mean, that is about the management of government. And you've got to, I mean, it's very undesirable, but either you are laying down a sort of series of ground rules which constrain the Prime Minister, in which case you're going to have an external regulator who's going to say you have just done something improperly. Actually, if the Prime Minister has procurement rules and they're breached, you can judicially review the decision already. So that's not impossible. And indeed, the procurement rules have been JR'd during COVID, and the government has been found to be in breach of their own procurement regulations. So I think ultimately those are very relevant issues, but they're not. It's not that we thought they were insufficiently important, but I actually think that our improvements will have an impact on those as well.
Yeah. Okay. You already mentioned John Curtis's work on trust, and one of the findings in the recent report that he and colleagues have produced suggested that Brexit played a role in the particularly marked decline in trust and confidence amongst those who voted to leave the EU. And at the same time, discussion of Brexit hasn't really featured in the election campaign. I just wonder, as Vice President of the European movement, what your take is on these two things. First, the decline in trust, and second, the absence of discussion of the topic during the election campaign.
Well, they are undoubtedly linked. On the first, I'm not surprised at what's happened, because I think it's easy to forget the turnout in the referendum was very high. I think, no doubt at all, quite a lot of people went and voted in the referendum who do not normally vote in general election.
Yeah.
Because they felt strongly about something. And I think we in the European movement need to remember this, because whilst people turned out, like myself and probably everybody on this call, this session this evening, because we felt strongly about Remain, a lot of people went out and voted because they thought that the European Union was in some way the root cause of a lot of things that they didn't like. And in doing that, they were swayed by what politicians were telling them, including that, yes, they were right to believe that this was the root cause of many of their things which made them angry and upset. And secondly, that it was capable of an easy solution by voting to leave, because on leaving, there would be a much better future for the UK. Now, my complaint is not actually with the people who went and voted that way, although I regret it. I'm sure they did it because they thought it was the right thing to do. And indeed, they're the people we need to persuade in the longer term to change their mind. I have very strong views about my political colleagues who persuaded them. Because, one of the reasons why we have representative democracy is that we elect people to go to parliament because the majority of people don't want to talk politics incessantly in the pub. They want to get on with their lives. They've got other things to do. They are reliant on people who are supposed to be spending much more of their time thinking about these problems to go and come up with solutions. So why should we be surprised that 8 years down the track from the referendum, they look at what's happened since? They see, one, it engendered high levels of political chaos and instability. Two, they eventually, let's face it, a majority, quite a large number, voted Conservative in 2019 to get Brexit done. And 4 years on from that, Brexit is in fact far from done, because Brexit will never be over in that sense. The economic benefits have proved to be non-existent. The disbenefits have proved to be pretty great. And many of the things which really upset them and made them vote for Brexit, like high levels of immigration, have not been resolved at all to their satisfaction. Their quality of life hasn't improved. Their sense of well-being is damaged. So I'm not surprised that we're facing a massive crisis. Now, in fairness, it's not unique to us. Look what's happening in France. Look what's happening in Germany. Western democracies are going through a period of really serious crisis. And confidence in democratic systems is probably at an all-time low. In the United States, it's showing itself in a willingness to elect an extremely dangerous populist, thug-like individual who may well get the presidency. So I don't think we should be surprised at what's happening, and Brexit, I think, has made it much, much worse. As for the question of it not being discussed, well, it is the elephant in the room. I know it's a much overused expression. And my view is that most of the things that are being said at this election are irrational unless you are prepared to consider the UK's trading position in the world, and that has to include a reconsideration of Brexit. Because the UK's competitiveness, I know there's arguments about COVID and arguments about the Ukraine war, and all those things have undoubtedly affected all European countries. But the sluggishness of the UK economy is, we know, the Office for Budget Responsibility has made clear, is at least 4% of our economy, it's a lot of our GDP, the direct result of what we've done to ourselves in putting up trade barriers with our closest partners. So if you want to, as Keir Starmer is saying, deliver lots of non-wage benefits to workers, you've got to find the money from somewhere to do it. And either we raise taxes or we have to increase productivity. And if we're going to increase productivity, why should Labour do spectacularly better at this than the current Conservative government? Because they too want to improve productivity, unless there is some way in which you can do it. And if our deals with Australia and New Zealand are, in fact, according to the OBR, worth nothing in terms of increasing our GDP, or so insignificant as to make no difference, and we're not getting a trade deal with the US, and we're not getting a trade deal with India, then trying to smooth out our relations with our EU partners and with the EU itself certainly helps. And Keir Starmer's hinted at it, but he balances that with saying, well, Brexit's not being reopened. But it is, and my view is it's going to happen. And I'm hopeful that if there is a new government, they will feel less constrained than the current one in admitting that the deal that we have under the TCA is unsatisfactory. But how easy it's going to be to change that, I simply don't know. And I think that the truth is nobody wants to talk about this. The Conservatives don't want to talk about it because obviously they're not going to wash their dirty linen in public as to how they engineered, or some of them engineered, this disaster. And for Labour, they know that a lot of the people they want to get to vote for them voted Leave and don't want to have it rubbed in that they voted for something which was mistaken.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of timescale, how would you see things? I mean, given that you know, I mean, we don't know what government we're going to get, but the Labour government has put down joining the customs union and the internal market as red lines.
Yeah. Well, if that's the case, then the fallback is trying to secure sectoral agreements on a sort of Swiss model, and I'm not sure the EU will give it to us. I think there are some things Labour are going to do. I think they will be willing to consider much closer political cooperation, which is outside the scheme of the main EU and, of course, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. And they may well try to do things like visas for young people, being able to travel and get jobs. I think there are various things. But my feeling, I mean, I may be wrong about this, but my feeling is that at some point in the next 2.5 years, unless there's an abracadabra moment and suddenly our economy starts to take off on the back of a boom, a world boom, but it'll still be sluggish compared to our partners, they are going to have to confront this issue. And they're going to have to ask themselves the question and come before the electorate and say, we need a closer relationship. And that means accepting some of the rules of the EU, which previously were regarded as being taboo. And the irony is, I think, in the current climate of opinion, as long as the theory of EU membership isn't mentioned, I suspect the majority of voters in places like Newcastle under Lyme and Ashfield in Derbyshire and all those seats which voted so strongly Leave in the old industrial belts of England and which traditionally had voted Labour and then abandoned Labour in 2019, I just don't believe that they're going to mind. Yeah. So I think it's more about timing than anything else. But there's no doubt it's true that nobody wants, even the Liberal Democrats don't want to talk about it.
No.
Sewage, but not Brexit.
Well, just maybe not that much difference.
Sewage is very relevant, I might add. I'm not criticising them for it, but it's a preference.
Jenny, I think you had something from social media to bring in.
Yep, there are actually lots of questions coming in, but there's a good one here from Jane. So the Brexit referendum stated leave EU or remain. Leaving the single market was not on the ballot, but became a political choice. How ethical is it that a future government might carry on this disastrously economic path and entertains it with no discussion on the subject?
Well, we live in a democracy. They can do it as long as they get elected. I mean, that is one of the problems of representative democracy. If people, governments do get influenced by public opinion. You can see it with the current Conservative government. When things get loud enough, they feel they have to do something about it. Governments want to be re-elected, therefore satisfying their electorate and not ignoring the electorate completely. It tends to work, but it can work quite slowly. Jane's quite right. The reality is that we had no discussion. We did have a discussion, but it was largely suppressed by the Leave supporters as to what form Brexit would take. Daniel Hannan was advocating a Norway-style relationship in the 12 months before the referendum, but he certainly wasn't 12 months later. And as I think was very predictable, when you do something which is revolutionary, which is what Brexit was, because it was a revolution in our existing affairs, turned everything upside down. Revolutions push everybody to the extremes. And once they start, they're very, very hard to stop. But this one has run out of steam. So that perhaps the chances are there that with a little bit of gentle pushing, Labour will realise that it has got, if it's elected, and the chances of its being elected are now very, very strong, they will realise that they've got to do something about this. And that if they can't deliver on economic well-being, then the risk is that we hit 2029 and we get a sort of what's happening in France or Germany with the AfD. You get a right-wing or extreme party, and it will probably be of the right because Labour is centre-left, arguing for radical solutions, and the fact those solutions may be crazy and incapable of implementation and unlikely to succeed won't prevent people voting for them.
Jenny, was there anything else that you wanted to?
Yeah, there's lots of questions coming in, but there's this one here came in from Martin. Should the next government be getting defence thinking closer to the EU while maintaining close support for NATO?
Yes. I think it's inevitable. We've got some very big issues on defence. Firstly, because we are not spending enough on defence. We are really hollowed out. And whilst this may have been acceptable in 2010, when this process started, because there didn't appear to be really real international risk, well, that's not where we are now. And whilst prioritising defence over health, for example, never very attractive, but the danger is, somebody made the point, you end up spending 2% per annum of your GDP on defence. You fail to raise it to 2.5. Real war or danger of war comes along, and suddenly, as Britain found in 1940, you're spending 46% of your GDP on defence. And that, of course, is economically catastrophic, quite apart from the consequences it has for your citizens and their lives. So I think we've got a very big problem. And my time as chair of the Intelligence Security Committee persuaded me of that. I think we're living in a very dangerous world, much more dangerous than any other time in my life. I think much more dangerous than when we had the sort of Soviet Union and the Cold War in the 60s and 70s. And we've got to do something about it. And America may remain a reliable ally, but I am not altogether persuaded it will be. It's true that at an official level, even during the Trump presidency, links were very well maintained. But Trump is now a very angry man. And if Trump gets re-elected, I just don't know where he's going. I mean, I think the United States is on a very dangerous path. And in those circumstances, it is actually a bit scandalous that European countries collectively, including the countries of the EU specifically, appear to be incapable of providing a credible deterrence on their own to Russia, notwithstanding the fact that our GDP is, overall is, I can't remember how many times greater than Russia's. Mm. And that needs coordination. And it is very telling that when Boris Johnson turned down the offer made by the EU, time of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, that we should be included in the EU's political councils to discuss international affairs. And hey presto, the Ukraine gets invaded and Liz Truss is immediately dispatched to attend the European Foreign Ministers' Council meeting in Brussels. And she's so embarrassed that she claims she's gone to a meeting of European NATO ministers, which is in fact untrue. It was called by the EU and by the Commission. So my view is that this is in fact going to be one of the key areas. And whilst I certainly don't wish to see NATO diminished, and the UK's right, just as the questioner was right, we shouldn't do that. I think the EU or the European limb is going to have to be greatly enhanced. And that means talking principally, key partners in this are Italy, France, Germany, and Sweden. And all the others have a role to play, but in terms of leverage and heft, they are the principal ones, and we're going to have to do that. And I think it's going to happen. I mean, I think it's already happening, even with Rishi Sunak's government, and I think it's going to happen further. And that's why the French, for all their irritation with us, recognise that the UK is the key partner for European defence purposes.
Jenny, do you have anything further?
Happy to take more. There are more coming.
Yeah, there's just one more question from Dee. She says today is the 8th anniversary of waking up to find out that the UK had voted to leave the EU. How did you feel on that morning?
Awful. I went and to begin with, the night before I'd gone to the festival hall where the Remain campaign was holding its sort of rally and sort of watching the results come in. And I went home at about 2:30 in the morning, and I knew it was going wrong. And then I came home. I went to bed and I slept very badly. And then I woke up in the morning and woke up about 3 hours later and switched on the radio and said to my wife, "We've lost this referendum. It's over." And then in the morning, I went back to the House of Commons and ordered some eggs and bacon and sat down to have a meal. And a very nice journalist came up to chat to me about what was going on. And my main comments were about Mr. Johnson, who I had very strong views about. And as it turns out, my views were rather prescient about Mr. Johnson and about the fact that he was a great tub-thumping populist demagogue, but he was incapable of delivering anything. And that was what would happen. It was thought at that time, of course, he was about to become leader of the Conservative Party. Even Michael Gove realised that Boris Johnson wasn't a suitable leader. So they postponed it for 3 years until he got it. But he proved to be exactly as bad. Leave aside his political views, he turned out to be idle, useless, actually, and incapable of providing any sort of leadership in the crisis.
Yeah.
So that's my memory. So yes, I was very depressed and quite angry. I've tried to curb my anger since.
Yeah, I think there are many of us who remember that morning rather well. So maybe just a last question, and again on a kind of broader issue. During the election campaign and before, sort of in connection with the the Rwanda policy that the government has, there's been a discussion about UK withdrawal from the Convention on Human Rights, and I suppose the question is whether is this just sort of like simple posturing in order to sort of like embrace people who might be tempted to vote reform, or is it something that we should kind of actively guard against in the long term, as perhaps we should have done with respect to EU membership and taken Nigel Farage more seriously sooner, given his ultimate success in getting Brexit through?
It certainly needs to be argued over. I mean, after all, I lost my role as Attorney General over this, although at that time it was scrapping the Human Rights Act and replacing it with the British Bill of Rights. The subtext was that the British Bill of Rights might not be wholly compatible with our obligations under the ECHR. My argument was that was very silly, but this was back in 2014. David Cameron had a bit of a bee in his bonnet about this ever since he was elected the party leader in 2006. I think it came from the time he'd been Michael Howard's special advisor at the Home Office, and he got irritated with court decisions in Strasbourg. So it had a long history, and I think also it offered in the early 2010, 2013, 14 period a sort of palliative to the EU. So it was a bit of red meat you could chuck to irritated, sovereignty-obsessed people. But the interesting thing was, Cameron may have sacked me, and he may have talked about this, but in fact, we've had, since it was first floated hesitantly by the Conservative Party as something that might be considered if we couldn't get our way over the Human Rights Act, back in 2006, we've now had nearly 18 years, and we are still full members of the ECHR. And interestingly enough, we still have the Human Rights Act. Now, there's no doubt that I'm sure reform, if it were ever to form a government, would put us out of the ECHR. It isn't realistic politics because our participation in the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU is dependent on our being adherent to the ECHR. So is the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. And the consequences of leaving the ECHR would really be to ostracize us and make our relations with our European partners very, very difficult. And I think on a commercial basis, it would effectively take us, I think, very quickly to a no-deal Brexit, so that we would be trading on WTO terms, and we would find it very difficult to maintain current arrangements, and certainly arrangements on sharing data, for example, which absolutely underpins modern business, would become, I think, very difficult unless we could show equivalence on that specific issue. So I think there is a problem, and I think it's unrealistic. And the hint at it in the Conservative manifesto is, I think, froth. The other thing is, if it were ever to be implemented by a Conservative government, then assuming they kept their seats, I am quite confident that the Justice Secretary and the current Attorney General would leave the government on the spot. And I think there would be others who would leave. And this is why I think it's a fantasy.
Okay.
And Labour are certainly not about to do this. So for the moment, I would sleep very tranquil in my bed that we are going to be in the European Convention and adherent to it. We're regarded as being one of the leading countries in its promotion. And it has done so much good, not just for us, but for our neighbours, and indeed for countries outside the EU, as the Council of Europe as well. We should be proud of it. So I'm not worried about this. Obviously, if you got a Conservative defeat, a Conservative party that lurches to the right, a Conservative leader inviting Nigel Farage to be a member of the Conservative Party, and the centre-right coming a total void, and in 2029 there's an election where Labour has failed, then this may be a live issue. But I think it can be parked for the moment. It's not going to happen.
Okay, well, that's some good news in the short term, at least. Listen, we've reached the end of our time, I think, and thank you for being so generous with yours and sharing your knowledge and expertise across such a wide range of areas. And it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much indeed. If people are watching it live and you want your friends to see it, this is just a reminder that it will appear in our YouTube archive shortly, along with, I think, about 90 other interviews that we've done over the last 4 or 5 years. So do look those up. But for now, thank you very much, Dominic. It's been absolutely fascinating.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.